Have you ever felt like you hit rock bottom, with no way out in sight? Like everything you tried wasn't enough, and despair was your only companion? This is Jonathan's story, a father on the brink of losing everything, who found a miracle in the most unexpected place. A heartwarming twist that proves even in the darkest moments, there's a light that can transform lives. Come and be moved by this incredible journey of hope and resilience. Don't miss it, click now and watch. Jonathan Harris sat at the small kitchen table in his house in Silver Ridge, staring at a growing pile of bills. The dim light of the lamp above cast restless shadows over the scattered papers. He pressed his temples, as if trying to push away the numbers that screamed his defeat. In the suffocating silence, the sound of light footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. Abigail, his 7-year-old daughter, walked in with a shy smile, holding one of her drawings. "Look, Daddy, I drew us going to the park," she said, holding out the paper. Jonathan glanced at the drawing for a moment, absorbing the contrast between his daughter's innocence and the crushing weight he bore. Forcing a smile, he replied, "It's beautiful, sweetheart. I promise we'll go to the park as soon as we can." But he knew that promise was empty. There wasn't even enough money to fix the old car. He needed to search for a new job. Dinner that night would be canned soup again. As Abigail returned to her room, Jonathan focused on the envelope at the top of the stack of bills. The eviction notice was clear. He had just 7 days to pay the overdue mortgage, or he and Abigail would be out on the street. Taking a deep breath, he tried to push away the suffocating feeling. He had tried everything: calling friends, requesting loans from the bank, even selling some furniture. Nothing had been enough. The doorbell interrupted his thoughts. He got up slowly, already anticipating bad news. At the door, a deliverman handed him another envelope, this one also from the bank. He signed the receipt, thanked him half-heartedly, and closed the door. Sitting back at the table, he opened the envelope with trembling hands. It was confirmation that further negotiations were no longer possible. Looking out the kitchen window, he saw the night swallowing Silver Ridge. The lights of the neighboring houses seemed to switch on in unison, each one representing a better life than his at that moment. Jonathan had always believed that hard work could overcome any obstacle, but now he was starting to doubt. Where was the reward for his efforts? Where was the justice that promised to lift those who never gave up? His mind wandered to memories of better times. He recalled the day he and Hannah, his wife, bought the house, brimming with plans for the future. The image of Abigail playing in the yard while Hannah prepared lunch seemed like a scene from another life. Since her death, Jonathan felt as though he had been in free fall. Abigail was the only reason he still got up every morning, but even that strength was beginning to wane. In the next room, Abigail hummed softly, oblivious to her father's inner turmoil. Jonathan closed his eyes and murmured to himself, "I just need one more chance. Just one more." He knew no one was listening, but he still felt the need to voice his plea. Finally standing up, he decided to leave the house for a few minutes to clear his mind. He put on his worn-out jacket, grabbed the keys, and stepped outside. The cold night breeze enveloped him, providing a small relief to the tension on his shoulders. He walked aimlessly, passing through the quiet streets of the neighborhood. Silver Ridge was small, but in that loneliness, it felt immense. During his walk, Jonathan stopped in front of a store with a brightly lit sign. The reflection of the light on the glass showed his own image, a weary man with an empty gaze. He wondered how he had gotten to this point. Feeling more lost than ever, he kept walking, his hands buried in his pockets. Back at home, he found Abigail already asleep, her small figure covered by a blanket that seemed larger than her. He approached, adjusted the blanket over her, and sat by her bed, watching her sleep. "I won't let you go through this, little one. I'll find a way," he whispered, though he had no idea how. When he returned to the table, the pile of bills was still there, a mountain he needed to climb. Yet something inside him refused to give up, a tiny spark of hope resisting the storm of despair. He picked up a blank sheet of paper and began listing his options again, forcing himself to believe that one of them might work. The night felt longer than ever, and the early hours of the morning brought more questions than answers. But Jonathan knew he had to keep going, even as desperation threatened to consume him. Tomorrow would be another day, and he needed to find a solution before it was too late. As the early hours of the morning crept in, Jonathan remained at the table, staring at the blank list in front of him. His mind, seeking a refuge from the crushing weight of his reality, drifted back into memories of a different time, a time when life felt whole. He closed his eyes, as if that might transport him back to those moments. And then, like an old photograph coming to life, the scene emerged vividly in his mind. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, 5 years ago. Jonathan was in the backyard, clearing leaves that had fallen overnight. Hannah, his wife, appeared at the kitchen door holding 2 mugs of coffee, her radiant smile as warm as the sunlight. "Jonathan, leave that for later. You promised to play with Abigail today, remember?" she said teasingly. She wore a simple blue dress he had always loved, and her laugh carried a joy that seemed unshakable. Abigail, just 2 years old then, ran toward him with outstretched arms, her tiny legs stumbling slightly over the grass. "Daddy!" she exclaimed. Jonathan scooped her up, twirling her in the air as she giggled uncontrollably. Hannah watched them, shaking her head with a soft chuckle. It had been a perfect moment, one he never imagined he would look back on with such longing. Jonathan opened his eyes, a tight ache forming in his chest. That same backyard was now covered in leaves he no longer had the energy to clear. Since Hannah's death 3 years ago, the house had felt hollow, as if its soul had vanished along with her. Hannah had been diagnosed with cancer only a year after Abigail was born. The illness came suddenly, like an uninvited guest, and the fight was short but harrowing. Jonathan had done everything he could to support the family while being at her side during every chemo session, every appointment, and every sleepless night of pain and uncertainty. In the end, he held her hand as she took her final breath. In the years that followed, Jonathan tried to stay strong for Abigail. He believed that, with time, he might find a new normal. But reality proved to be crueler. The medical bills left behind were crushing, and without Hannah's emotional support, the weight was unbearable. For a while, he managed to keep things afloat, working long hours as the manager of a local auto repair shop. Then, when the economic downturn hit Silver Ridge, he was laid off without warning. Since that day, every moment had felt like an uphill battle against forces far beyond his control. Jonathan got up from the chair and paced the nearly empty living room. Most of the furniture had been sold in desperate attempts to cover bills. On the wall, a single family photo remained, framed and hanging above the empty fireplace. In the picture, Jonathan, Hannah, and Abigail sat together on a park bench, their smiles wide and unburdened. He stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity, his vision blurring with unshed tears. "I promised to take care of you both," he murmured to himself, his voice breaking. "I promised." Abigail was the reason he kept fighting, but the weight of his promises felt unbearable. He wondered what Hannah would say if she could see him now. She had always been the optimistic one, finding hope even in the darkest moments. It was a trait he admired in her but could never fully replicate. Maybe that's what he lacked now, hope. The distant bark of a dog brought Jonathan back to the present. He knew he couldn't afford to dwell on the past for long. As painful as it was, he had to keep moving forward, for Abigail's sake. But the memories of those better days were a small anchor, holding him to something beyond the chaos of his current life. They didn't solve his problems, but they reminded him of who he once was and what he was fighting for. With one last glance at the photo on the wall, Jonathan returned to the table and sat down, his resolve hardening. Those memories, however bittersweet, had ignited a tiny spark of determination. For Hannah, for Abigail, and for the promises he made, he would keep fighting. Somehow, someway, he had to find a way out of the storm. The next morning, Jonathan woke to the first rays of sunlight streaming through the half-closed curtains. He wasn't sure when he had fallen asleep, but the papers scattered across the kitchen table were evidence of another night spent searching for answers. Abigail was still asleep, and he decided to leave early to avoid her innocent but painful questions. Pulling on his worn-out coat, he checked for loose change in his pocket and stepped outside. The car, still broken down in the garage, was a constant reminder of how dire his situation had become. The streets of Silver Ridge were quiet at that hour, with only a few people walking or opening their shops. Jonathan walked briskly, as if the urgency of his steps could somehow alter his circumstances. He had a destination in mind, the bank where, just a week earlier, he had made his last attempt to renegotiate the mortgage. He knew his chances were slim, but he couldn't face losing the house without trying everything. For Abigail's sake, he had to try. When he entered the bank, the sound of the air conditioning and the clicking of keyboards contrasted with the calm outside. Jonathan went straight to the counter and asked to speak with the manager, Patrick Monroe, who was already familiar with his case. After a few minutes of waiting, Jonathan was led to a small glass-walled office at the back of the bank. Patrick greeted him with a polite smile, but the tired look in his eyes revealed that he already knew how this conversation would end. "Jonathan," Patrick began, flipping through the file in front of him, "I understand your situation is difficult, but as we've discussed before, the bank can't extend any more deadlines without collateral." Jonathan leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in a gesture of desperation. "Patrick, I know I'm asking for the impossible, but I just need one more month. I'm looking for work, anything. I just need more time to pull the money together." Patrick sighed, closing the file slowly. "I wish I could help, I really do. But you're months behind, and the bank's policies are clear. If we don't receive payment by the deadline, the house will be auctioned." "I'm sorry, Jonathan." The words felt like a final sentence, crushing the last shred of hope Jonathan had held onto. He thanked Patrick politely, stood, and left the office before anger or despair could overwhelm him. Walking back through the streets of Silver Ridge, he felt the desperation building in his chest. Each step seemed to echo his thoughts, spinning in endless circles, searching for a solution in a maze of dead ends. The sound of a car approaching broke through his haze. He looked over his shoulder to see a blue sedan pulling up beside him. Inside was Mike Carter, an old friend he hadn't seen in years. Mike rolled down the window, flashing a friendly smile that seemed oddly out of place against Jonathan's bleak mood. "Jonathan Harris. Man, it's been ages," Mike exclaimed as he stepped out of the car to greet him. Jonathan forced a smile, but his worry was written all over his face. "Mike, what a surprise. How are you?" "I'm good." "Need a ride? Looks like you're heading home." Jonathan nodded, accepting the offer. Inside the car, Mike began asking questions about Jonathan's life, and, hesitant at first, Jonathan eventually opened up about his struggles. It was difficult to admit how far he had fallen since the days when they worked together, but Mike listened intently, his concern genuine. "Look, I don't know how much I can do," Mike said as he pulled up in front of Jonathan's house, "but I'll see what I can arrange. Maybe I can find you some temporary work or someone who can negotiate that debt with you. Don't give up yet, man." Jonathan thanked him, though he doubted that Mike's help would come in time. Back in the kitchen, the pile of bills seemed to mock his efforts. He spent the rest of the day making phone calls, searching for any job, any lifeline that could help. Every response was the same, a polite but firm rejection. That evening, while Abigail slept, Jonathan made a decision. He knew he couldn't stay frozen in despair. The next morning, he would sell the few valuable items he had left, starting with the antique pocket watch his father had given him. It was a cherished heirloom, but he'd rather part with it than let Abigail lose her home. As he prepared for bed, he looked once more at Abigail, curled up peacefully under her blanket. "I won't let you lose this house," he whispered, his voice filled with quiet determination. He didn't know how he would manage it, but he believed that somehow, he had to keep going. The sound of raindrops tapping against the window woke Jonathan before dawn. The city seemed shrouded in a thick fog, a perfect metaphor for his weary and overloaded mind. After yet another unsuccessful day trying to sell his belongings and find temporary work, the emotional strain weighed even heavier. Abigail, still blissfully unaware of the gravity of their situation, played around the house as if it were just another ordinary day. For her, life remained simple and carefree. For Jonathan, every passing moment was a grim reminder that time was running out. As the afternoon gave way to evening and Abigail retreated to her room to play, Jonathan decided to step out for a walk. He had no particular destination, but he needed a moment away from the crushing reality of the bills, the phone that rarely rang, and the overwhelming silence of desperation. The streets of Silver Ridge were wet and mostly empty, with the occasional flicker of streetlights breaking the dim glow of the rainy night. A sharp breeze cut through him, making him pull his jacket tighter as he walked aimlessly. Before long, he found himself standing in front of a small red brick church. Its illuminated sign seemed to shine brighter than any other light on the street. The message on the board read, "When everything feels lost, there's always a light." Jonathan stood there for a long moment, reading and rereading the words. They were simple yet strangely powerful. He wasn't a particularly religious man. His faith had waned after Hannah's death, buried under the weight of grief and responsibility. But something about the message compelled him to step inside. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a modest but warm interior. The faint smell of old wood mingled with the soft scent of burning candles. The church was nearly empty, save for one man kneeling at the altar in quiet prayer. Jonathan hesitated, feeling out of place, but eventually took a seat on one of the pews at the back. For a while, he simply sat there, staring at the arched ceiling and letting the stillness of the space envelop him. After a few minutes, the man at the altar rose and walked toward him. He was the church's pastor, Reverend Elijah Moore. A man in his late 50s with a kind face framed by graying hair, Elijah smiled warmly as he approached. "Good evening," the pastor said, taking a seat beside Jonathan. "I'm Reverend Elijah. Are you all right?" Jonathan let out a long sigh. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, he felt comfortable enough to answer honestly. "No, I'm not all right. My life's a mess and I don't know what to do anymore." The pastor listened in silence as Jonathan poured out his troubles. He spoke of his mounting debts, the looming eviction, and the relentless fear of failing Abigail. Each word seemed to lift a fraction of the burden he had been carrying alone for so long. When he finally finished, Elijah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Jonathan," the pastor began, his voice calm and steady, "sometimes we reach a point where it feels like all is lost. But I believe that's often when God works most profoundly in our lives. Have you ever sought a light to guide your way?" Jonathan shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "I don't know how to believe in anything anymore. All I've done is try, and yet, I'm still losing everything." The pastor stood and walked to a nearby table, returning with a small envelope. "I don't have all the answers, but I feel God brought you here tonight for a reason. Take this. It's not much, but perhaps it's a start." Jonathan took the envelope, surprised by the unexpected gesture. He tried to refuse, but the pastor insisted. "Use it for whatever you need most. And remember, Jonathan, miracles aren't always what we expect, but often what we need." Leaving the church, Jonathan opened the envelope. Inside was a small amount of money, enough to buy groceries and cover a few immediate expenses, though far from enough to solve his larger problems. Yet, for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Walking back home, he looked at the city lights with a new perspective. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. Perhaps there was, indeed, a light waiting for him, even if it wasn't yet fully visible. The next morning, Jonathan woke with a bittersweet feeling. The envelope he had received at the church lay on the kitchen table, a small lifeline that would help him get through a few more days. It wasn't a solution, but it was enough to keep him and Abigail afloat for a little while longer. Sitting at the table with a steaming mug of coffee, he watched Abigail walk in, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She seemed blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around them. "Daddy, can we get ice cream today?" she asked with an innocent smile. Jonathan hesitated, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Maybe this weekend, sweetheart. For now, we need to save our money, okay?" Abigail nodded, accepting the answer without protest, and skipped back to her room, humming a tune. Jonathan felt a pang of guilt. He hated turning down her small, simple requests. The weight of broken promises sat heavily on his chest. He had to do something, anything, to ensure that Abigail wouldn't lose her home. Determined, he pulled out a wooden box from the back of the closet. Inside was a family heirloom, his father's antique pocket watch. Its intricate design and polished metal gleamed even in the dim light of the room. It was one of the few things of value he had left, a piece he had planned to pass down to Abigail one day. For generations, it had been a symbol of resilience and pride in his family. But now, it was simply a last resort. Jonathan held the watch in his hand, his thumb tracing the engraved patterns. His father's voice echoed in his memory, telling stories about how the watch had survived through hard times. The irony wasn't lost on him, it was about to do so again. He let out a deep sigh, tucking it into his coat pocket, and set off toward the town's pawnshop. The streets were quieter than usual as he walked. The crisp morning air bit at his face, but it was the thoughts in his head that truly chilled him. Every step felt heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of not just the watch, but his entire past. The shop bell jingled as Jonathan stepped inside. Behind the counter was Gary Turner, a middle-aged man known for being fair but tough in his negotiations. Gary greeted him with a nod, his sharp eyes quickly noticing the watch Jonathan pulled from his pocket. "This is a beautiful piece," Gary said, examining it closely through a magnifying glass. "It's worth a lot. I can offer you $500. Jonathan knew it was worth far more, but he wasn't in a position to argue. The urgency of his situation outweighed sentimentality or pride. "I'll take it," he said quietly, his voice heavy with resignation. Gary handed over the cash, and Jonathan left the shop feeling as though he had just lost another piece of himself. When he returned home, Jonathan used part of the money to pay the overdue electricity bill, ensuring they wouldn't lose power. With the remaining amount, he bought basic groceries, just enough to stretch for a week. It wasn't much, but it was something. That evening, while Abigail slept, Jonathan sat in the dimly lit living room with a newspaper spread before him. He scoured the classifieds, desperate to find any job that would pay quickly. But each opportunity required resources he didn't have, transportation, tools, or experience he didn't possess. Every rejection was another blow to his fragile hope. The sharp ring of the phone startled him. He answered, his heart momentarily lifting at the thought of a job offer, only to be met with the cold, automated voice of a creditor. It was yet another reminder that his time was running out. Jonathan hung up, his hands trembling with frustration. He turned toward the window, his reflection faintly visible against the dark glass. The man staring back at him was a far cry from who he used to be. He was no longer the confident, hard-working father and husband. Instead, he was a man desperately clinging to the threads of his life. But despite everything, he knew he couldn't give up. Not for himself, but for Abigail. Before heading to bed, Jonathan checked on Abigail. She lay peacefully under her blanket, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her small, serene face seemed like the only light in his dark world. "I won't let you lose your home," he whispered, his voice filled with quiet determination. He didn't know how he would make good on that promise, but he was resolved to keep fighting until there was nothing left to give. Jonathan woke early as he did every morning, his mind already weighed down by worries. The $500 he had gotten from pawning the pocket watch offered a temporary reprieve, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover the mortgage. Sitting at the kitchen table while Abigail quietly colored a picture, he racked his brain for a plan. Each idea seemed to dissolve under the sheer magnitude of the obstacles he faced. Then the phone rang. He didn't expect any important calls, the only ones he'd been receiving lately were from creditors, but he answered anyway, his voice weary. "Jonathan Harris?" "Mr. Harris, my name is Claire Bennett. I'm calling on behalf of the Heart of Hope Foundation. We'd like to schedule a conversation with you, if possible." Jonathan frowned, confused. "Heart of Hope? I don't recall reaching out to you." "I understand, Mr. Harris. Your situation came to our attention through an anonymous recommendation. We help individuals facing extreme difficulties, and we believe we may be able to offer you some assistance. Could we talk?" At first, Jonathan suspected it might be some kind of scam. The world didn't seem kind enough to offer help for free, especially not to someone like him, who had become so accustomed to rejection. But there was something sincere in Claire's voice, and the mention of an anonymous referral piqued his curiosity. "All right," he replied cautiously. "When and where would this conversation take place?" "We can meet today if that works for you," Claire said promptly. "We're in town and can meet wherever you feel comfortable." After arranging the time and place, Jonathan hung up, still skeptical. He glanced at Abigail, who was now engrossed in her drawing, and sighed. What did he have to lose? If it turned out to be a dead end, he'd find out soon enough. But if it was real, it could be the lifeline he so desperately needed. Later that afternoon, Jonathan met Claire at a small, family-run cafe in town. Claire was a woman in her 40s with a warm smile and a confident yet approachable demeanor. She greeted him kindly and got straight to the point. "Mr. Harris, our foundation exists to help people in situations like yours. We understand you're facing eviction and have been doing everything you can to provide for your daughter. Our mission is to intervene in moments of crisis and offer not just financial support, but also a path toward long-term stability." Jonathan crossed his arms, still cautious. "Why would you do that? What's in it for you?" Claire leaned forward slightly, her tone steady and calm. "Our only goal is to help. The foundation is privately funded by donors, and the people we assist are recommended by those who believe in their potential. In your case, someone who knows you reached out to us and asked us to evaluate your situation." Jonathan sat in silence for a moment, processing her words. "So what does this mean? Are you offering to pay off my debts?" "It depends," Claire replied, her voice practical but encouraging. "We cover immediate expenses, such as your mortgage, and help you stabilize your situation. In return, we only ask that, in the future, you pay it forward by helping others in need when you're able." The simplicity of the arrangement caught him off guard. He had been bracing for a catch, for some hidden clause or impossible condition. But Claire's frankness made it hard not to believe her. "Who recommended me?" he asked, his voice softer now. Claire smiled but shook her head. "I'm afraid that information is confidential. All I can say is that this person has great faith in you." Jonathan felt a lump in his throat. Someone believed in him, even when he struggled to believe in himself. He thought of Mike, the Reverend Elijah, or perhaps another friend from the past. Regardless of who it was, this opportunity felt more real with each passing moment. Claire handed him a few documents and explained the next steps. The foundation would pay off his overdue mortgage and provide a modest fund for immediate expenses. In exchange, Jonathan would participate in a financial mentorship program to help him rebuild his stability. It was a fair and straightforward deal, almost too good to be true. That night, back at home, Jonathan watched Abigail sleep peacefully in her bed, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. The house was safe, and for the first time in months, he felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. The money from the foundation wouldn't solve all his problems, but it was a starting point, a chance to rebuild. Taking out his phone, Jonathan sent a text message to Mike. "Thank you for believing in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself." He didn't know for sure if Mike was the one behind the anonymous recommendation, but he wanted to express his gratitude nonetheless. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jonathan lay down to sleep, allowing himself to dream of a future that seemed, at last, a little brighter. Morning broke over Silver Ridge with a clear sky and a gentle breeze, as if the universe itself was aligning with Jonathan's newfound sense of hope. For the first time in months, he woke up feeling lighter. The day before, Claire had confirmed that the foundation had paid off his overdue mortgage. The relief was indescribable. There would be no more threatening calls or notices on the door. The house, the last tangible connection he and Abigail had to Hannah, was safe. Jonathan sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, when the phone rang. He picked it up without hesitation, expecting it might be Claire or someone from the foundation with an update. To his surprise, the voice on the other end was familiar. "Jonathan, it's Mike. Did everything work out with the foundation?" Jonathan couldn't help but smile. "Yes, Mike. They paid off the debt. I don't even know how to thank you. You were the one who reached out to them, weren't you?" Mike laughed softly, but there was sincerity in his tone. "Yeah, it was me. When you told me what was happening, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't help you directly, but I knew the foundation could. You deserved this chance." Jonathan closed his eyes, gripping the phone tightly. "You saved my life, Mitt. You saved Abigail's life. I'll never forget this." "Don't think about it that way," Mike replied. "Just pay it forward when you can. Help someone else the way I helped you. That's all I ask." After the call ended, Jonathan sat in silence for a moment, overwhelmed by gratitude. He looked over at Abigail, who was playing on the floor with her dolls, completely unaware of how close they had come to losing everything. That night, after putting Abigail to bed, Jonathan stood in the quiet of the house, reflecting on everything that had happened. The house was no longer just a structure. It was a symbol of second chances, of unseen support, and of resilience. He made a promise to himself to honor the help he had received by becoming a beacon of hope for others. The miracle wasn't just in the money or the house. It was in the realization that, even in his darkest moments, he was never truly alone. This was Jonathan's inspiring story and how hope can emerge in the most unexpected moments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and share it with someone who needs a message of faith and resilience. Together, we can spread even more light and inspiration. Thank you so much for watching.